Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is the Liberalism Roundtable discussion. So, Sean, as the classical liberal, why don't you give the introduction?
Very well, you've put me on the spot here. You want me to tell you what liberalism is?
Not so much what it is, but why you think it's true or why you support it.
Well, I think I should tell you what liberalism means to me, because otherwise we're just we're in a void. Liberalism is one of those words like progressive or godly, which means anything the speaker wants it to mean. Now, of course, it is possible to make a case for particular kinds of liberalism. And that being said, let me try to explain what I mean by liberalism, or what liberalism means to me. Liberalism is a doctrine or a set of associated doctrines which emerged at the end of the 17th century and made considerable way during the 18th century, which is largely based on the norms of British political and legal experience. What it means sounds rather platitudinous nowadays. It means that so far as we must have government, it must be conducted in the interests of the governed. Government is a trust for the governed. It should, in some sense, be accountable to the governed. Power, so far as it must be exercised according to fixed rules which are stated in advance. Moving away from the institutional aspects, liberalism is a commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of association. It is a belief that human reason is of great importance, and that if applied properly to the objects brought before it, can bring about a remarkable transformation in our lives, a transformation for the better. Now, I know that there are multiple definitions of liberalism, and I know that some people who call themselves liberals are not liberals in any sense that I or mine might recognize. And I know that the world in which we live is an often chaotic and even evil place. But if you look at the civilization in which we live, from as far outside it as you can place yourself, what you'll see is that even now we live in an astonishingly liberal civilization. It is the exception, not the norm, in our countries, that people are taken into police cells and beaten to death for saying something with which the authorities do not agree. It is the exception, not the rule, that people are made subject to extreme and arbitrary power. I'm not saying we live in any kind of utopia, and I've spent a fair bit of my life complaining about the non-utopian aspects of our civilization. But I do spend a lot of my life looking at the history of non-liberal ages, and the difference between ourselves and our more remote ancestors is striking in many ways. And one of the most striking differences between us and them is our concern for the reasonable rights of others. That is what I mean by liberalism. I don't mean the I do not regard liberalism as a doctrine at war with transphobia, a doctrine at war with all the various other isms of our age. I regard it as a concern with human autonomy and human well-being.
Okay. In alphabetical order, I suppose we'll begin with Keith. So do you have anything you want to add or comments to make?
Well, I agree with most of what Sean has said, in the sense that I think that liberalism has brought about a great deal of transformation in modern civilization that's, for the most part, been quite positive. If we go back and look at what illiberal societies from the past were like, or when we look at what illiberal societies in the contemporary world are like, we see that liberalism, I think, starts looking pretty good. It was liberalism that introduced the idea of rule of law, meaning that, at least in theory, the law applies to the rulers as well as to the ruled. The idea, as Sean said, that power should be accountable to the people that it governs. The idea of freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, free speech, freedom of the press. All of these things, for example, that you see in documents like the American Bill of Rights and things of that nature. Yeah, that's when I think of liberalism. That's what I think of. I suppose my main criticism of liberalism is that it doesn't go far enough in terms of limiting the power of the state or limiting the power of institutions over society as a whole. So I suppose I'm probably to the left of liberalism in that regard. Now, one criticism I would have of liberalism is that, like any other system that becomes powerful, it tends to have the effect of creating a new ruling class that replace the old ruling class. And I do think that out of liberalism, we saw the growth of the industrial revolution, which was generally a positive thing, but we also saw along with that the negative side effect of the class polarization that happened during the Industrial Revolution, and we saw the rise of this new class of financial elites that replaced the old aristocratic class. So a new system of oppression or exploitation or whatever emerged. And also, I do think that a problem that we have in modern liberal societies is statism. That is, the state simply intrudes into every aspect of life in ways that older societies often did not. Even if there were other disadvantages in older societies. In older societies, they might break you over the wheel for insulting the king's honor or something like that. But they didn't really try to micromanage every aspect of society in the way that modern states do. So I do think there is some gray area in that. But for the most part, I would consider liberalism to have been a positive development. So I'd second Sean on that.
All right. For the record, I muted Sean and Jim because of background noise. So if you guys could keep yourself muted when you're not talking so we can hear the other person, that'd be great. But so yeah, Jim, that all sounds really good. What's wrong with that? Are you still here, Jim? Yeah, you need to unmute yourself, Jim. There we go.
I need to what?
Oh, you needed to unmute
Oh,
yourself.
okay.
Sorry about that.
Technical problems.
Yeah. So yeah, what that all sounds rather nice. What's maybe inadequate about that account of things?
Okay, yeah. Sean's account is this minimal account of liberalism, which is very typical. It's it doesn't make many assertions. It says that we ought to prevent that acts in a lawful, orderly way, and it should recognize some freedoms. And that sounds acceptable or even good to most people. Lawless government is not good, and it's nice to consult with the governed because, after all, they know things that the guys on top don't. And government, like most political thinkers have agreed should really be for the benefit of the governed, for the public good, which is something that everybody participates in. And also, you really can't micromanage people, so therefore it's nice to have some freedoms. The difficulty is that, as Sean puts it, it doesn't really say what the ultimate point of the whole thing is. So that's something that people simply don't leave alone. Because man is a rational animal. People try to bring their activities and thoughts into some kind of systematic order. And so therefore, when they work together collectively, they have to be able to explain to each other why what they're doing is for the good. Questions come up, and the questions have to be answered. So whatever is for the good has to be refined. So ultimately, find that any society is going to have some idea of what the human good is, what the right kind of life is, and sort of facilitating and making possible and enabling people to live that kind of life. And guiding things in that direction is going to turn out to be the function of government, because why support it? Why be willing to? There's a war, if there's civil disturbance, or if you're appointed to public office and you have to do something that means that you don't simply follow your own self-interest, but rather do something that is for the public good. Why should you do any of that? And so, I think you have to have sort of a richer, broader, or deeper account of liberalism to make sense of the way it actually develops, and actually has developed. Because, it says, well, you should be orderly, and you should have these freedoms, and you should let people and promote people getting what they want. And so that does turn out to be an account of what the good life is. And the good life is for people to get whatever it is they want. And since wants are equally wants, that should be equal for all wants and for all people. So in the long run, it turns out to be maximizing equal preference satisfaction. And it starts out, and there's these inherited institutions like the English idea of property, which is property. And so it starts off with something like John Locke, who says, well, everybody should be able to increase his property by dealing with each other and working and making whatever decisions make sense. But in the long run, that doesn't work, because there's no special reason why property, the rights of one person in some physical object or a piece of land or something, or whatever it is that you can have property in, should be sacred. Because the idea is to give people what they want as much as and as equally as possible. So you begin to bring in redistribution, because, people have property, and wouldn't maximize preference satisfaction if you transferred something from the rich to the poor. It wouldn't hurt the rich much, it'd help the poor a lot. And then as it goes on, that broadens. And the idea of what's socially constructed expands, because liberalism tries to avoid metaphysics. It doesn't say what's natural, what human nature is like, what the world is like. It just says, well, there are these agents that want stuff, and we got to deal with them equally. So the stuff that they have an equal right to becomes broadened until we have the situation we have now, in which things like social esteem, or your self-image, or your self-concept aren't supposed to be favored in any way by the society as a whole. And so the function of government becomes ensuring that, because after all, government is supposed to prevent people from oppressing each other, and the people oppress each other by social customs and attitudes that say that your image of yourself isn't as good as something else. Done by that, about that. And so you end up, because of the lack of any idea of human nature, of the human good, other than being able to pursue your goals as you understand them, in a situation in which the state, which is here to protect us from oppression, has to control and supervise and reformat all human interactions and relationships, so that the of liberty pursued without a concept of what the good is and what human nature is turns out to be the philosophy of absolute servitude and dictatorship. That's the objection I would make.
Okay. I have a couple of thoughts on liberalism. One of the first problems that I see with it is this comes from Burke in his Reflections on the French Revolution. He argues that politics should not be a priori, but more like the scientific method, a posteriori. And we see with modern political philosophy, there does tend to be this a priori component to it, which fails to take into account the messiness of humanity, but also the misunderstanding that the political scientist has of humanity. So he has this, as Mises said, a bloodless man, this bloodless abstraction, and then devises a political system for that bloodless abstraction. Well, what ends up happening is that's not a real man, and real men don't conform as easily to that ideal as they would, that the person crafting the political theory would have expected. The other one is sort of the false neutrality of liberalism. In an article in 2009, Ed Feser wrote about the false neutrality of libertarianism. And he mentioned, of course, Nozick, who's a liberal, though maybe not of the same kind as Sean tonight. But the liberal family tree, the libertarian family tree have very similar common assumptions. And one of them is this neutral umpire that negotiates between two competing interests. And as Feser points out in this essay, that what happens is whenever you try to actually put flesh on the bare bones of liberalism, it ends up being more or less right-wing or more or less left-wing, and isn't actually neutral in any meaningful or interesting way that might solve these disputes. It's sort of wearing the mask of neutrality when it's actually behind the scenes picking a side. The modern Harvey Mansfield, in his work on Machiavelli, he points out that in many ways Machiavelli was the first modern, because he taught specifically the thing that Harvey Mansfield cites was his play The Mandrakes, where basically you have the goal is, by breaking moral conventions, we both get what we want. There was a childless couple of a noble birth, and there was a man that wanted to sleep with a married woman. And so they cut out a deal where he gets to sleep with the married woman and they get to have the child. And everybody's happy, even though they violated the moral norms. Bacon, the father of modern science, would later claim inspiration from Machiavelli. And Machiavelli famously says in The Prince that we should discuss not man as we want him to be, but man as he is. And so there's this level of amorality that is that the modern liberal tradition with social contracts and no clear definition of the good or virtue, that's a result of this cascade effect of the sort of Machiavellian movement. One of the underlying philosophical, metaphysical assumptions of liberalism is nominalism, the idea that there's no abstract forms. They're purely conventional, with the corollary of nihilism. Nihilism in the sense of mereological nihilism. Mereology means the study of being, and nihilism means the lack of purpose. So a mereological nihilist would say that there are these uncuttables. They're no longer called atoms because we've already named the atom and split it. They call them simples. And so you don't have dogs or cats. They don't exist. You just have simples shaped dog or cat-wise. So if there's no actual identity to a thing, then the kind of drift of identity politics, I can identify as a 40-year-old man can identify as a 6-year-old child. These things seem to flow naturally from the denial of forms, right? Which liberalism is implicitly embedded within the liberal project. And by denying the forms, then when somebody says, well, they wake up and want to be a Komodo dragon or a helicopter or a little girl, there's really not much the liberal state can do to say, well, no, that's outside of the bounds of what we're going to enforce. And we see this today where, you know, if you don't accept people with these delusions, you can get into real hot water politically. And lastly, there was recently a debate between Fareed Zakaria and Niall Ferguson about the liberal order, the liberal world social order of liberalism, and its ability to provide security. And Ferguson points out that it is currently failing to produce security, and of two kinds, sort of employment security and physical security. As the physical security we see with terrorist attacks and all throughout the Western Europe, and they're not doing anything to stop it. And the interventions in the Middle East are aggravating that condition by sending these people into Europe. And then, of course, the outsourcing of jobs beginning in the 90s leads to economic insecurity. And so to the extent that liberalism provides security, it isn't liberal. It's using illiberal measures of force and coercion to provide the security. But if it doesn't provide security, then the liberal order will disintegrate. So it's kind of caught in this catch-22. So I think we'll let Sean respond to the range of objections and hear from him on this. I think you're still muted, Sean. To unmute yourself, Sean, you just go to the top center of the window that we're in and hit the microphone button. There we go. Oh no, he was unmuted, then he's muted again. While we're waiting for Sean to unmute himself, do you have anything you want to add, Keith?
Yeah, I can add a few things. One of the criticisms I'm hearing of liberalism is.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, we can. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Sean.
Oh, I do apologize for breaking in. There's something wrong with my microphone this evening. Okay, Keith's objection is something I might accept, that liberalism is a fine thing but may not go far enough. Todd's objection and Jim's objection, the short answer is that your dislike of liberalism does not really touch the kind of liberalism that I mean when I talk about it. Let me explain. I do not regard liberalism as a freestanding ideology like Marxism, which can or should entirely replace the current order of things. I've always regarded liberalism as an add-on, as something which merges with the present order of things. Now, you may not be able to achieve a very satisfactory mix if you start with something like the Aztec Empire or the Assyrian Empire or with ancient Carthage. And the attempt at merging some degree of liberalism with the institutions of the Soviet Union during the 1980s brought on a sudden and irretrievable collapse of the entire system. However, if you take liberalism and you mix it with something like the English order of things in the 17th and 18th centuries, or if you take it and mix it with the French order of things in the 19th century, if you add liberalism to a European civilization, which already contains a great deal of liberalism, let's face it, what you get is an improvement. Now, my sort of liberalism has no objection to hereditary monarchy, even to divine right hereditary monarchy. All we say is that the king is subject to the laws. We have no objection to an hereditary aristocracy with some legislative powers. All we would say is that the aristocrats themselves should be subject to the law, and there should not be institutions like the Ius Primae Noctis, where the local lord has the right to sleep with somebody else's wife on the first night. We have no objection to an established church, though we do say that dissenters from that church should not be burned at the stake, and they should also not be persecuted. We do not believe in making windows into men's souls. We believe that the state is very unwise if it tries to control things like the price of bread or to set a minimum wage. But we are not anti-national. We believe in the existing nation into which we are born. We're not saying that all inherited institutions and customs and laws should be swept aside in some frenzy of leveling, followed by a new construction of utopia. What we are saying is that the current order of things should be so adapted to recognize the reasonable rights and expectations of the governed, and that government should be humane and rational in its application. Now, that says nothing about nominalism. It says nothing about the persecution of homophobia or racism or transphobia or sexism or any of the other isms of our age. It simply says that so far as possible and so far as convenient perhaps, people should be left alone to look after themselves. It does not, I repeat, mean that we should sweep aside the inherited material of our ancestors.
Okay, maybe to clarify, one of the objections that I made that I think is more to the point is, you had mentioned, Sean, that liberalism was an add-on to a pre-existing order. Now, the last objection that I made with Niall Ferguson touches a little bit on that, in the sense that if it needs some pre-existing social material to work with, if it were to turn out to be the case that the application of those liberal principles would itself undermine or hollow out that pre-existing cultural substrata, then it would in the proverbial sense be sawing off the branch that it's sitting on. And that at least was one of the objections that I was trying to bring up, if it was maybe clumsily worded.
Yes. I think it's worth saying that there are some pre-existing social orders which deserve to be hollowed out and destroyed. Ours are not among those. I mean, as I said, the Aztec Empire was a highly traditionalist civilization, but it is not something that many conservatives I know would go out of their way to defend. Equally, the Soviet Union by the 1980s was a highly conservative and established order of things. Yet I think we were all at least quietly pleased when it collapsed. Now, does liberalism of the kind that I've described necessarily hollow out the British or the English and American and French and German nations? No, it doesn't. It has no objection to the pre-existing order of things. I've gone out of my way to accept hereditary monarchy, established churches, and to some extent privileged aristocracies. All I ask is that those institutions should be modest in their claims. They should be subject to the same laws as everybody else. And so far as is convenient, people should be left alone. I fail to see, I really fail to see how not breaking people on the wheel for fanciful crimes, how not burning people at the stake for taking a different conception of church authority from that of the state, can in any sense hollow out the society in which you're born. It improves it.
Okay. So you're just contesting the fact that liberalism, of this crime that you ascribe to, would be a universal solvent. You would say that's in fact not the case.
It is not the case, but I do accept. You see, liberalism is one of those words, I'll repeat myself, like progress or democracy or godliness, which everyone adheres to. You could probably, you can find the most authoritarian, indeed totalitarian thinkers who would describe themselves as liberal, but of course who are not. Of course, in America, liberal is, on our side of things, a term of abuse, and it is embraced by people whom I would not regard at all as liberal. What I'm doing is I'm trying to state what I mean by liberalism and defending that. If you want to attack another kind of liberalism, good luck to you. I might agree with you.
Okay. Without making this into a philosophy debate, which would be beyond the scope of this current roundtable, even a minimalistic definition as such as the one you gave, would you at least concede the point that there are certain metaphysical presuppositions that go into such a minimalistic claim?
Such as?
Well, we had talked after our last roundtable about some of your philosophy, and some of the English, if this is sort of the development of, which it sort of is, of the English people, it's a development of an English way of looking at things, which is typically empiricist. Like with Hume, he says we talked about that famous point where he said, anything that's not mathematical or experimental should be cast to the flames, the pervert metaphorical flames. And so that kind of a mentality to accept some of these propositions is already held to beforehand.
It feeds, when you're talking about the intellectual output of a particular nation, it's hard to put the various parts of that output into different boxes. And liberalism, empiricism, utilitarianism, toleration, all sorts of things come out together, and they stand together. Now, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Do you think that judicial torture should be brought back? Do you think that heretics should be tortured and executed? Do you believe that all school teachers and anyone else working with the young should be required to sign up to a particular set of propositions laid down by a committee of our present state. Do you believe that all property should be owned by the state? I could carry on asking those questions, but I suspect your answer is no. In which case, what we're doing is not arguing because we are all on the same side. We're just arguing to some extent about words, and sometimes about how far the meanings of those words should be carried.
I think the nature of the question that you asked could be looked at in another way, because I think what the question as stated in that sense indicates that seems to be trying to make the claim that those of us that accept those things as reprehensible would only do so for liberal reasons. But I would challenge the idea that there are no non-independent reasons to object to those behaviors.
I'm sure there are many non-liberal reasons for objecting to them, but the fact that you object to all of them and you reject them all unexamined is a very good reason for calling you at the very least a closet liberal.
Well, that would only be the case if there was no other position that could consistently reject all those others without being a liberal. And I think that is yet to be demonstrated.
Well, yes, but then we're arguing over the meaning of words, not over the state of affairs that ought to be.
Well, no, because if we have two beliefs, call them A and B, that can both independently justify rejecting these positions, they might have very little in common as far as their metaphysical assumptions and how they work out in daily life. It just happens that in this case, for two independent sources, they converge on a similar agreement. So it's not just a matter of words, it's a matter of underlying assumptions that lead to these conclusions.
I think one of your assumptions, at least one of your unspoken assumptions in rejecting those propositions, is that people should very largely be left alone.
I don't understand the question. Can you rephrase that?
If somebody wakes up tomorrow and says, I do not accept Jesus Christ as the only begotten Son of the Father, you will not put him in prison, will you?
No.
You may not want to employ him. You may regard him as a very wicked person, but you wouldn't put him in prison.
Well, sure.
No, of course not. And if somebody says, well, we don't really know if he committed this particular crime, so let's pump water into his stomach until it bursts, until it nearly bursts, and then see if he'll confess. You would say that is probably not the best way of establishing criminal guilt. And as I said, I could go through a whole list of things which you reject, probably with horror. And since they're the same things as I would reject with horror, what actually are we arguing about? Even if you call yourself a conservative, in the particular civilization in which we live, you are, in effect, a liberal. And any hardcore reactionary from the 18th century would not regard you in any sense as a kindred spirit, though I should imagine most liberals would feel comfortable to have you around.
Well, the reasons why one would not need to do that is the golden rule as we find on the Sermon on the Mount. And, well, I wouldn't be a reactionary in the sense of de Mystere. 500 years ago, when the Anabaptist movement developed, I would probably be welcomed very easily. So there is this robust, independent justification for not doing these terrible things. In fact, before there even were liberals, it was the Anabaptists that were saying these things were unlawful to be done. But
well,
I'd ask...
We would accept Anabaptists as proto-liberals.
Interesting. Before, when you were still muted, I'd asked Keith to make some comments. I still would be interested in Keith's opinion on some of these things. So what are your some opinions on these conversation, Keith?
Well, to some degree, I agree with Sean in the sense that what Sean is outlining seems to me to be the very basics of liberalism. If you accept things like the torture of criminal suspects and persecution of political or religious heretics as something that's legitimate, then I don't see how you could have liberalism. Now, it is possible to oppose those kinds of things on other grounds other than liberal grounds. I do think that as far as the question of power, that power should be accountable, that power should be dispersed in some way, that excessive concentration of power is a bad idea. I don't think that that's a uniquely liberal value. It certainly predates the rise of modern liberalism. It's an idea that you can find in bits and pieces of traditional cultures of many different types, including those outside the West, something you can find in at least within strands of different religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, bits and pieces of Islam, even Zoroastrianism and some others. So I do think you can find justifications for opposing excessive power or abusive power or things of that nature outside of liberalism. But another objection I'm hearing to liberalism is, if I'm understanding correctly, is the idea that, well, liberalism really has no vision of what the good society is, or what the good life is, or what human nature is, or how human beings ought to live, and things of that nature. I think to some degree that's true, in the sense that liberalism is more about politics and law and government and perhaps economics and then maybe ethics and philosophy and all that, those are contingent upon these other things. I don't think liberalism as something that has a comprehensive worldview in terms of interpersonal ethics and every aspect of life. But I don't think that that's a problem that's unique to liberalism. Even in throughout history, in cultures before the rise of liberalism, and liberalism has only been dominant in the Western world for a couple of centuries, and it's still not dominant in some other places. But in the ancient world, there were still plenty of competing visions about what the good was, about what the good society was. If we go back and read all the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, Epicurus, the Sophist, Zeno, Diogenes, all the others, we see that they had radically different ideas about what the good life was, the good society was, what virtue was. We see that in ancient Chinese philosophy when we compare the legalists with the Taoists, with Confucius, with the Agrarians, and others. So this argument about, well, what is the nature of man or humanity? What is the nature of human existence? How should life be lived? What is the good society? This is something that long predates liberalism and not something that is unique to liberalism. I agree, liberalism doesn't answer all those questions, but most other philosophies don't either. As far as time periods in history in which religious thinking tended to be dominant, we saw the same conflict there. The Protestants, the Catholics, the Muslims, the Jews, they certainly couldn't agree among themselves about what the good society was either. So this is an age-old human problem. We see this in antiquity, we see this in the Middle Ages, we see this in modernity. And I have the distinct advantage or disadvantage of being somewhat far left politically and far right philosophically, in the sense that I'm a radical classical liberal to the point of being an anarchist, whereas philosophically I seem to be somewhat rightward leaning, in the sense that I do have a conception of humanity that's somewhat like what you find in thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes, and more recent thinkers like Schmidt, in the sense that I do see human beings as largely being self-interested creatures, and individually and collectively. And a good part of what history is, and a good part of what society is, and a good part of what politics is individuals and groups with conflicting interests struggling with one another for dominance, and not just material interests. I'm not just talking about accumulating wealth and property and things like that. That's part of it, but also what might be called psychic interests or psychological interests, in the sense of having different visions of what the good life is, or the good society is. And in fact, I often think that really those kinds of conflicts are much more fundamental and often more lethal than conflicts over over merely material goods. You may have on one hand a group of pirates that only care about the loot and profit, but you may have zealots for ideologies, philosophies, religious beliefs, or whatever that are just as aggressive in terms of seeking to gain dominance for their own perspective in that regard. And this is something that's always been there. This is a problem that's always been there. And I think the value of liberalism is that liberalism doesn't try to answer all of these big questions on some comprehensive level. Instead, it's something that's more about trying to keep warring factions from killing each other. While there may be a wide range of disagreements on what the good society is or what the nature of virtue is or the good life is, I think most human beings, of the majority, agree that peace is generally better than war. There are some people who don't believe that, but most people do. That prosperity in an economic sense is generally better than starvation or deprivation. There may be some people who dissent from that, but most people don't. Most people are not libertarians by nature, but most people generally prefer not to be pushed around, but beyond a certain level. Most people generally agree that some degree of civil peace between different ethnic groups and religious communities and things like that is generally a good idea. And I see the value of liberalism being those kinds of things, and that liberalism does provide a means by which people with otherwise irreconcilable differences can at least coexist without slaughtering each other. A good example is in the United States, for example, for all of its problems, we do have the First Amendment. And under the First Amendment, you can legally belong to any kind of political organization you want. And you can really voice any political opinion you want. And that's not true even in some other democratic countries. There are some things you can do in the United States that might get you arrested, or at least, you might get a visit from some authorities in some European nations. And I think even in Canada, that's true. The same thing is true with religion. There's no religion in the United States that's formally prohibited by the state. That's not true a lot of places. Even like in Russia, for example, I saw recently where the Russians actually banned the Jehovah's Witnesses and confiscated their property, which probably would not happen in the United States because of the First Amendment. So liberalism does provide this kind of framework where, again, people with radically different views, whether it's the LGBTs or whatever on one hand, or the Mormon Church on the other hand, can coexist up to on some level without slaughtering each other. A lot of the political conflicts we have, certainly in the United States, and I probably would guess the same is true in many other democratic countries, stem from the fact that there's differences of opinion on how liberal values ought to be interpreted. For example, one is involves the application of separation of church and state. There's nobody in the United States that seriously believes that we should have a state religion. I mean, maybe some people on the margins do, but that's not a commonplace point of view. There's nobody that really believes that we should have a Soviet, Stalinist-like repression of religious communities. Maybe there's people on the margins that think that, but that's not very common either. Instead, it's more in different interpretations of civil rights in a liberal context. That is free exercise. Where do you draw the line between free exercise and non-establishment? Or where do you draw the line between freedom of conscience and non-discrimination? Or where do you draw the line between even with controversial issues that have religious undertones like abortion, between freedom of choice and freedom of a right to life? So that, I think that that's a substantial improvement over things like what we see in Saudi Arabia, where it's basically a question of, well, do people who think differently even have the right to exist? So I think that liberalism is of tremendous value in that sense. Now, I do agree with Jim in particular, what Jim has been saying about how we do have this kind of radical left liberalism or something that does want to level the entire society, that views that everything that ever came before as being oppression. That's not something I have any time for. Like the people who want to take down the Confederate monuments, who say we should never celebrate or recognize Columbus Day. Nowadays, they're saying things like they don't want to celebrate Christmas or any of these kinds of things. I never had that much or any interest in this kind of the idea that cultural, the roots of a particular culture need to be uprooted and changed because of some, because it's a representation of some terrible thing that happened in the past or something like that. I think that that's not necessary and pointless. But I do think that liberalism has value in these other ways that I've been describing. And as far as the criticisms, the problems with liberalism, I don't think that's unique to liberalism. That's something that is, again, that we see that in the ancient world, we see it in the medieval world. That's an ongoing problem. It is the contending views of human nature, the good life, and things like that. But I see the core values of liberalism, like the ones that Sean was describing, as being something that are over and above that, in the sense that, well, it's not just about determining who has the good life, or the best vision of what the good life is. It's more about keeping people with different visions of the good life from killing each other.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add, Jim?
Okay, am I on?
Yeah, you're on, Jim.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I haven't mastered this muting thing yet. Okay, Sean, of course, is which is very English to maintain this minimalist idea of liberalism. Really, all it is let's be sensible. Let's not push things too hard. But there really isn't the final authority is. What in the end answers the question? And yeah, I think it's questions about, well, do you want to torture people who are accused of crimes and so on? Have to do with, well, do you want to push things far? But
You're breaking up, Jim.
authority.
Still there, Jim? That's unfortunate. We seem to have lost Jim.
That is unfortunate.
Well, we're near the end of the hour, so we could have some closing statements. We'll have Keith can go, then Sean, and if Jim gets back before it's over, then he can have one too. So why don't we start with some closing statements with you, Keith?
Well, I would rather someone else go first, since I just spoke for a good while. I'd like to hear some feedback on the things that I just said before I make a closing statement.
Well, how about you, Sean? Yeah.
Okay. I'm always in the slightly unfortunate position of not really disagreeing with anything that Keith says. But since the setup of this program requires me to disagree, I will say that Keith sometimes appears to be arguing from an assumption which is stated he would reject. And his assumption appears to be that around 350 years ago, somebody stood up, John Locke, let's say, and said, I've just invented this wonderful new ideology, and I will call it liberalism. It is quite like anything which has ever existed before. Whereas, in fact, liberalism has deep roots in our civilization. And to say that there are aspects of liberalism in the Renaissance or in the Middle Ages or in some of the city-states of antiquity is not to say that liberalism has no reasonable monopoly over these things. All I would say is that liberalism has deep roots, and Keith is drawing attention to some of those roots. I would also say that my own particular conception of liberalism is, of course, not a final statement of the ideology. There are some statements of liberalism with which I would take very strong exception. I'm sure that there are many other liberals whom we would accept as good liberals who regard me with a certain disquiet. But the core of liberalism is that you try to behave reasonably to other beings, and you require the authorities to behave reasonably. And in that sense, I am stating what, even now, in the second decade of the 21st century, a decade in which some very bad things continue to happen, is the hegemonic ideology of our age. You don't pick up much English news in America, but a couple of weeks ago, our Prime Minister, Theresa May, stood up and said, our values are freedom of speech and due process and respect, and therefore, to defend these fundamental British values, we will censor the internet. Now that is a crude version of a mental trick which is played all the time, that in order to defend liberalism, you need to abolish it. But what Theresa May is doing is illustrating that liberalism is the hegemonic ideology, and that any deviation from it must somehow, no matter how crudely and incompetently, be justified on liberal grounds. I wish that liberalism were rather more hegemonic than it is, but it is. And so, in that sense, none of us, and certainly not Jim and Todd, are arguing against it. You are picking holes with certain bits and pieces of other conceptions of liberalism that you find disagreeable. But there is nothing in itself illiberal about how you, if made absolute ruler of your country, would behave.
Now that Jim is back, we were giving ending statements, but before we go any further, we'll let you finish the original point you were making, Jim, before your recording software flicked out.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You chopped up for a little bit.
Okay, that's good. I think it was my connection. It's flaky at times. Anyway, Sean, says liberalism is hegemonic. It should be more hegemonic, which means that it has to be a supreme standard. And the problem is that in the long run, even in England, as opposed to the continent, man is a rational animal. Questions come up; they have to be answered, so that this approach to things that Sean wants to say and believes, and for a long time, no doubt, was a principle of not pushing things too far and respecting people and not being too sure that this measure or that measure will be the right one, so you don't want to squash people who oppose it. In the long run, the basis for making that an ultimate principle is going to come through. And so that, one way in like some American debates that's expressed is to say that in the long run, Anglo-American liberalism, which in those debates is presented as the good liberalism, continental liberalism, ended up bad, oppressive, anti-religious, extreme liberalism that you might see in the French Revolution or something, where you want to force people to be free. And it seems to me that's unavoidable in the long run. There has to be some implicitly some ultimate standard's going to sort out. And especially at present, where you have this instant communication and increasingly organized and hierarchical and educated society that's run by regulation rather than by people's sense of how things should be, that's going to happen. So what liberalism has become is not arbitrary. It's not a matter of some bad conception of liberalism, just somehow wandering in and displacing the good conception that people could just as easily keep living by. It's a matter of the natural development of an approach to things that worked for a while in Western civilization, because Western civilization had all this diversity and this idea of separate powers from the Middle Ages. Separate powers, distributed powers of the value of the individual, the value of reason. So eventually, making this principle of, let's look at the question of utility, let's look at the question of equality, let's look at the question of freedom, making that into the ultimate standard that eventually decides all questions, gives us what we have now. So it's not arbitrary. And since things have turned out as they have, we really have to say, well, gee, liberalism, just is a project that has turned out as a standard of things not to work in the long run, like many other things that don't work, many other human things that don't work in the long run if you keep at them. So therefore, we have to think of what else to do. And I guess that's my comment.
Okay. Do you have any closing statement, or does that sum that up well enough for you?
I guess that was intended as a closing statement, but and I'm sorry to aim it all at Sean, who presents this case very intelligently, and sort of in the English matter intelligently, and with a lot of thoughtfulness and so on. But I just don't think that that's enough, and so I'll sign off, and let everybody else have the last word.
Okay, so Keith, what are your last words?
Well, I suppose that the one question that I would have, and I'll just leave this as an open-ended question as part of my final statement here. If the liberal paradigm that dominates virtually all modern industrial democracies were to be eliminated, I mean, if the paradigm of liberalism were to fade, I'm not sure what exactly would replace it, but I don't necessarily think it would be something that any of the four of us would like. For example, I think that on one hand, it's certainly possible that liberalism could be replaced as the dominant philosophical paradigm by some kind of religious perspective, but I suspect if that happened, it would probably be the religion of Islam, not any kind of Christianity, at least in terms of the way world historical trends are developing. More likely, I think if liberalism were to fade away, it would be replaced by some kind of overtly authoritarian or totalitarian ideology, either from the left or from the right. In fact, one thing that I have noticed in American political culture in recent years is that on the margins, it seems to me that more and more people are embracing authoritarian ideologies of different types. More and more I see hammer and sickles at leftist demonstrations, and I see people from some of these alt-right groups embracing fascism and military dictatorships and things of that nature. So if liberalism were to go away or to lose its influence, I don't think that what would replace it would be something particularly desirable, in terms of creating a better society. Even when we look at countries around the world that are semi-liberal, one example is Russia. Russia is a partially liberal state and partially illiberal state, and I don't know that the illiberal features of Russia are any more desirable than its liberal features. I know there are a lot of traditional conservatives in the West who admire the Russians for not embracing gay rights or transgender rights or whatever. And, whatever the case for that, it's also true that there's some evidence that the Russian state assassinates journalists that are critical of the regime. That's kind of off the subject, but I see there are certainly features of that particular regime that are illiberal in many ways, but they're not necessarily positive. And historically, illiberal regimes do engage in arguably just as many abuses as liberal regimes, sometimes more, sometimes much more. So I'm not a big fan of arguments that say, well, if not this, then what? But I do think that's somewhat true in the sense if we reject the liberal paradigm altogether, I'm not sure what would replace it that any of us would find acceptable.
Okay. For my closing statements, I will sort of dovetail with Jim here. Is that the liberal issues the issues that I take with liberalism are, for these closing statements, it's metaphysical presuppositions that lead to conditions that none of us would find conditions worth living in. And secondly, liberalism is a kind of any member of the family tree, even if it's the more urbane English liberalism of Hume and Locke and Burke. It's a sort of universal solvent that once it dissolves the foundation for which it's been built on, there's nothing left for it to stand on, and then it topples over. And I think we're beginning to see that with the inability of the liberal order to maintain order and protect its own citizens from Islamic terrorism. So thank all you guys for coming. It was a very interesting conversation. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.